No training, no team, and no glory. Being a medieval assassin wasn't a job. It was a death sentence. In just a day, you dodge guards, lie to everyone, and risk betrayal from the one person who hired you. Let's relive a day in their harrowing lives and shatter the myth of the cool, mysterious killer. Imagine this. You're standing in a muddy street that stinks of rotting garbage, sweat, and animal waste. Around you, the world feels hostile and uncaring. There's no warmth, no comfort. Your stomach has been empty for days. Your clothes are more patchwork than fabric, and everyone who might have helped you is either gone or worse off than you are. Now, imagine looking down at a dagger, stolen, chipped, and dull, and realizing that this is your best shot at survival. This is where the story of many medieval assassins begins. Most of the time, people didn't become assassins because they wanted to. It wasn't like those elaborate tales of secret guilds you might have heard about, with initiation ceremonies, ominous cloaks, and rules of honor. The truth is, the people who fell into this life weren't chosen for the job. They were backed into it, cornered by a world that offered no other options. Poverty, shame, betrayal. These weren't just conditions they endured. They were the foundation of their decision. Take a peasant, for example, someone whose family is starved while the local lord lives comfortably behind stone walls. Maybe the last crop they planted failed. Maybe locusts or flood wiped out any chance of making it through winter. When hunger gnaws not just at you, but at your children and your spouse, you're left desperate enough to do almost anything. You don't become an assassin because you've weighed your options and decided it's a great career move. You do it because nothing else exists. Even worse, going unnoticed was often the very reason these people were drawn into the work. A disgraced soldier begging at the side of the road looks forgotten. He's just another face nobody cares to remember. He knows how to fight, even if it's for scraps, and his ruined reputation makes him invisible to those in power. For someone in desperation, like a noble plotting a rival's death, that invisibility makes the perfect cover. It's not like anyone is going to mourn the death of a beggar who happens to get caught. And yet, it gets bleaker. Deciding to pick up the knife wasn't just about risking someone else's life. It meant abandoning parts of your own humanity. Think of the guilt, the fear, the paranoia that would come with turning yourself into a killer. Imagine jumping at every sound in the dark or washing blood off your hands, knowing it won't ever come off your conscience. Each choice might solve today's problem, getting food, shelter, coin. But it pulls you further into a life where no one respects you, no one defends you, and absolutely no one trusts you. There's a story that makes it all a bit more vivid. Picture a father, a peasant, scraping by on what's left after endless taxes and rents. One year, the harvest fails. His wife falls ill, his children close behind. He tries to seek help from his lord, but the gates stay shut. He begs at the church, but the priest hardly glances up from counting donations for the bishop. That man, our desperate father, sits on the side of the road when a finely dressed stranger approaches. The stranger doesn't look charitable, but his smile twists with something colder. He offers coin, not enough to save the family long term, but enough to buy a few weeks of food. The catch? A blade and a target. Let's say it's another local peasant or maybe a rival steward causing problems for the stranger. The father doesn't say yes right away, but his children are crying, his wife coughing. And what choice does he really have? By the time he's standing over some poor victim, gasping for breath, he knows there's no going back. The tragedy doesn't stop there, of course. The same qualities that made people perfect for assassination also made them completely disposable. When you're a nobody, no one misses you if you disappear. If you fail, there's no one to defend your honor. In fact, one of the only reasons you might even get this job in the first place is because whoever hires you knows they can do without you. You're a pawn. You have no safety net, no backup plan, and no one stopping them from turning you in. The moment you become inconvenient, and sure, maybe some of those recruits were tougher than most. A former mercenary might know how to wield a sword, how to move quietly, how to fight dirty. But think of the mental toll, choosing over and over to take life because your own feels meaningless. You'd have to numb yourself to it all, pushing grief or even pride so far down, you forget what normal days felt like. Constant desperation leaves little room for hope or dreams or anything other than making it to the next meal. What anyone looking from the outside might see as ruthlessness is really just survival on its last legs. The emotional cost wasn't the kind of thing you could shove aside forever either. Families who relied on what little conscience their loved ones had left might have been abandoned entirely. It's hard to look someone you care about in the eyes after returning from a job that involves ending another life. More than one assassin's story ended with them estranged from whatever family they had left, either out of shame for what they'd done, hatred at being judged, or fear of exposing the people they cared about. But it's not like a miserable past or a guilty conscience stopped the system from using them. Once the first job was done, the real nightmare began. Their employers, if you can even call them that, might start dangling more coin in front of them, knowing that once someone kills once, killing again becomes easier. It wasn't like there was some happy ending waiting for when enough jobs were completed. There were no retirement plans, no guarantees. The moment they outlived their usefulness, their employers would cut ties, or worse. This is where the spiral really starts, because having taken that first plunge, being an assassin wasn't just a job anymore. It became the whole world they lived in. You might assume some level of improvement, more practice, better skills, the hope of trusting someone now and then. But the reality was starkly the opposite. Each step made the ground under them shakier, added more enemies to their list, and carved more of their humanity away. And let's not forget, the dire start to each assassin's life wasn't just a personal tragedy. Many of them took part in a system that crushed anyone unlucky enough to get in their way. Sure, the noble or merchant they worked for benefited, but those with power couldn't care less about the pawn on the board. The very reasons these assassins were invisible, class, shame, desperation, are what made them such perfect scapegoats whenever things inevitably went wrong. Assassins didn't just have to watch their own backs. They also carried the knowledge that someday, no matter how careful they were, their story was going to end bloody and alone. And yet, it was the beginning. That desperate, awful moment when the first blade got picked up that set everything else in motion. Because once this was your life, no path led back to being a farmer, a soldier, or whatever small but honest life you'd once had. For every coin earned was a piece of the person they used to be, lost forever. So no, it wasn't some thrilling choice. Forget ideas of assassins living in shadowy mansions with underground training arenas. Forget visions of camaraderie and honor. This was a trade born out of desperation, a hand grasping in the dark, because there was no one else to reach out to. For many, there literally was no choice to make. It was either pick up the blade or starve. And once the blade was in hand, the nightmare only deepened. Congratulations, you made it this far. But speaking of nightmares, let's get into what happened. after. They took that first step, and how surviving as a medieval assassin meant learning from mistakes that often came at the cost of someone's life. Imagine you've just been hired to carry out your first kill. No one tells you how to do it. The only advice available is, don't get caught. That's it. There's no friendly mentor to guide you through your new, terrifying career. No hidden manual with step-by-step instructions. No secret techniques passed down through generations. You're expected to figure it out yourself, with hardly more than luck and a stolen dagger at your disposal. And if you fail, well, failure isn't just embarrassing, it's fatal. Forget any romantic visions of secret guilds with long cloaks and candlelit ceremonies. As it turns out, medieval assassins didn't get invited to any such club. Nobody handed them an impressive set of tools or trained them in some shadowy courtyard nestled behind city walls. The idea of formal training wasn't just rare, it was non-existent. Instead, assassins were left to navigate this deadly profession as desperate amateurs, essentially working a job with no safety measures, no roadmap, and no room for error. Trial and error became the grim reality of their education process. But let's be honest, there wasn't much room for the error part to play out. Experience was the only teacher, and every mistake carried life or death consequences. Any slip in judgment didn't just jeopardize the mission, it guaranteed a gruesome end, either at the hands of guards or an angry mob. New recruits often learned the hard way that being bad at their job might lead to public hangings, torture, or worse. It made every assassination attempt an impossible gamble. Even their weapons emphasize just how rudimentary this business was. Their kill kit wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. Not that medieval times were brimming with cutting-edge tech to begin with. If you were lucky, you'd have a dagger. If you were unlucky, it might be stolen, chipped, or dulled from years of use before ever reaching your hands. Fancy custom-made tools or inventive gadgets we see in modern assassin stories weren't part of the equation here. Instead, you had to make do with whatever you could scavenge. A rusty blade. That'll have to do. A garrote improvised from rope pilfered off an unattended cart. Better hope it's strong enough. If all else failed, you might even eye something ridiculous. A broken roof tile, a sharp nail, or even a particularly sturdy shoe buckle, and hope for the best. And then there was poison. If you're imagining sleek little vials of perfectly dosed substances, think again. Poisons in the Middle Ages weren't precision-engineered tools. They were crude, unpredictable concoctions brewed out of desperation. The ingredients. Whatever seemed dangerous, sometimes plants, sometimes minerals, sometimes, apparently, toad guts. Measuring doses wasn't a science back then, and getting it wrong was terrifyingly easy. Too much, and your victim dropped dead in a way that practically screamed assassination. Too little, and you only made them slightly ill, as they carried on with their day and likely rounded up their guards to track you down. And that's assuming you made it past the kitchen staff in one piece. Medieval kitchens weren't known for their organization, and many households employed food tasters or used dogs to sniff out anything suspicious. Between that and the general chaos of meal prep in the era, slipping poison into your target's goblet was significantly harder than the stories make it sound. Picture yourself, sweating behind some crumbling wall in a castle, timing your every move as maids dart in and out of view. You've got your dubious bottle of poison, hoping it will do the trick, and then you knock it over onto the floor. Disaster. There's one grim account where exactly this kind of failure spelled doom. An assassin, tasked with poisoning a local figure of power, tried mixing a handmade poison into the target's wine. Their mixture let's say, was less than effective. Instead of a clean, discreet death, the target survived long enough to accuse the would-be assassin. Caught in the act, they were dragged into town, paraded through the streets, and executed in front of the very people they were hoping to avoid. Failures like that weren't rare. They were a constant risk, especially for those just beginning in the trade. If trial and error carried so many risks, then where else did assassins pick up the skills they needed to stay alive? Occasionally, they absorbed a stray bit of knowledge from thieves, mercenaries, or anyone else skulking outside the confines of lawful society. A thief might teach them how to climb walls or pick locks quietly. A mercenary could offer some tips on handling a blade during a struggle. But these were brief and unreliable encounters. Few people were willing to take a murderer in training under their wing. After all, if you let a killer get close to you, how could you guarantee they wouldn't one day turn that skill set on you? Formal mentorship was almost unheard of in the assassin's world. This work was isolated, lonely, and short-lived. Mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire. They disappear. That chilling reality hung over anyone foolish enough to enter this line of work. You don't pass down lessons to a successor when you're barely capable of surviving another day yourself. Any success they managed to achieve rarely meant confidence or safety. Instead, it simply postponed disaster. Imagine carrying out a mission, slinking back to your hiding spot, and spending the next days or weeks wondering if someone would storm through the door at any moment to take you down. That paranoia wasn't just a side effect of the job. It was the job itself. One slip and you were done for. When they weren't wrestling with constant dread, they were likely improvising just to get through the day. Did your dagger break mid-mission? Grab something sharp, anything sharp. If you couldn't find a replacement for your lost weapon, you had no choice but to get creative on the spot. A roof tile might suddenly double as a blade, that nail sticking out of a rotted beam. Grab it and hope it works. With such patchwork supplies, the idea of being an assassin sounds less like it came from an action movie and more like it came from, well, a twisted medieval scavenger hunt. There's no denying how exhausting this must have been, physically, mentally, emotionally. Imagine every job leaving you more drained than the last, every mission carving a little more out of who you were. Assassins back then didn't celebrate their successes. The closest thing to a reward they got was survival itself. They lived from one day to the next, haunted not by guilt alone, but by the sure knowledge that a single mistake could bring it all crashing down. One mistake, that's all it ever took. Miss the target, and the game was over, brutally, publicly, and without mercy. Catching assassins became an event. They weren't quietly disposed of in jails. Instead, they were dragged out for dramatic executions, designed to teach everyone present that stepping out of line could cost more than just your life. Words like flaying, quartering, and burning became all too familiar ends for those caught in the act. If fear could be made visible, it was watching an assassin's body hung in a marketplace for days after their death, sending a clear message to anyone who dared attempt the same. Assassins didn't just fail as individuals, they also endangered anyone who might have helped them along the way. If captured, they weren't likely to stay quiet in the face of certain death. Interrogation techniques ensured that family members, friends, or allies, anyone who had lent even the smallest hand, might find themselves dragged down alongside the assassin. Even those uninvolved could fall under suspicion, as authorities searched for proof of wider conspiracies. The ripple effect of failure spread outwards, taking innocent lives alongside the guilty. It's no wonder so many assassins lived in constant fear. But fear wasn't the only emotion haunting them. Exhaustion, paranoia, and, perhaps worst of all, the irreversible loneliness that came with working in such a cutthroat, unforgiving trade must have weighed on them heavily. Every decision was calculated not just for survival, but for the few scant hours between jobs where rest could be found, and even then, sleep never came easily. The life of a medieval assassin was an endless tightrope walk, where balance was key and the stakes were impossibly high. No training, no tools, no room for error. They couldn't even dream of being professionals in the modern sense. Professionals learn by doing, sure, but they also get second chances. Medieval assassins didn't. Even when they succeeded, the road ahead never got easier. The next mission loomed, the next mistake lurked, and every shadow, every rustle of wind served as a reminder that a single wrong move could erase every brief victory. And, as we'll see, there was no guarantee of safety, even if you did make it through. Because for medieval assassins, the quiet threat of betrayal lingered closer than any blade. Think about this for a second. What's worse than risking your life to sneak into someone's chambers? It's finding out that the person who hired you has already decided you'd be better off dead. As a medieval assassin, betrayal wasn't just common. It was baked into the job. Trusting your employer was like trusting a wolf not to bite. And yet, you had no choice. After all, cutting deals with people plotting murder isn't exactly the kind of arrangement built on mutual respect and good intentions. Clients didn't hire assassins because they liked them. They hired them because they needed someone desperate enough to take a dangerous job and disposable enough to toss aside when it was over. These weren't friendly relationships. They were transactional, cold, and designed to leave the assassin with as little leverage as possible. Once you completed the job, you became a loose end, a person who knew too much and could easily be erased. The lies began the moment the job offer was made. A client might promise a bag of silver if you pulled off the hit, but chances were they had no intention of actually paying you. Oh sure, they'd give you a small advance to reel you in, just enough to make you believe the rest of the reward was waiting at the finish line. But the phrase, "when the job is done," was often code for, "you won't live long enough to collect the rest." And let's face it, they had all the power. What were you going to do if they broke the deal? Sue them? Complain to the local authorities? The minute you took on that contract, you gave them all the control. Even when the payment was legitimate and the setup seemed straightforward, there was always a catch. Political scheming and personal vendettas often turned assassins into pawns in a much bigger game. In some cases, the entire contract was a setup, an elaborate sting where the supposed target wasn't real, and you were walking into a trap from the start. Imagine creeping into what you think is a quiet room, only to be surrounded by guards who've been tipped off to your arrival. It wasn't always incompetence that got an assassin killed. Sometimes it was the plan all along. But even when the contract played out as intended, no surprises, no fake targets, it didn't mean you were in the clear. In fact, finishing the job might have put you in even more danger. Killing your target was only step one. Step two was trying to survive the frenzy that followed. Your victim's allies would hunt for the killer, sure, but the person you expected it from least, your own employer, had just as many reasons to turn on you. After all, you were now someone who could connect them to a murder. Keeping you alive was a risk they didn't need to take. In some cases, it wasn't even subtle. There are stories of employers hiring one assassin to carry out the kill, and then secretly hiring a second assassin to take care of the first. It was efficient, if nothing else. Pay one to do the dirty work and the other to clean up the mess. After all, dead assassins don't talk, and they can't expose who hired them. In fact, that's where the phrase cleaning up loose ends might have felt uncomfortably literal. Take, for example, an assassin hired by a noble to eliminate a rival. The job goes according to plan. The target is dead, and the assassin should be celebrating a successful payday. Instead, as they're leaving the scene, they notice someone following them. A second shadow in the darkness. That shadow isn't an accident. It's another killer, hired to ensure no one traces the murder back to the noble. The first assassin barely escapes through sheer luck, managing to fade into a crowd before their own life is taken. But they've learned a hard lesson. Never assume that you're safe, even when the contract is complete. For assassins, nothing came without a strategy. Paranoia wasn't just a personality trait, it was a survival skill. Many began developing their own safeguards, knowing full well they couldn't rely on others for protection. One common tactic was demanding payment up front, even if it risked making clients nervous. Others carried false documents or disguises with them at all times, ready to disappear the moment things went south. Some even staged their own deaths just to escape notice. But even then, these precautions could only take them so far. When your entire profession depends on secrecy, the enemy isn't just your target, it's everyone around you. These betrayals weren't just about money or broken promises. They shaped every decision an assassin made. Friendship, too dangerous. Lovers, what if they found out too much? Everything about an assassin's life had to operate in the shadows, not just because of the nature of their work, but because the fewer people who knew who they were, the better. Trust was an unaffordable luxury. But of course, you can only live like that for so long before it starts taking a toll on you. Think about what it would do to your mind, your ability to connect with others. Imagine living every day knowing that anyone you cross paths with might be your undoing. Any friendly face could be the one that betrays you. If someone even hinted at knowing too much, what did you do? Walk away? Pretend it never happened? Or worse, did you have to silence them to protect yourself? It was a lonely, isolating existence. Even fellow criminals often kept assassins at arm's length. These weren't people you wanted to be seen with. By associating with them, you might end up with a target on your own back. Their work brought heat, and heat was the last thing any self-respecting thief or smuggler wanted. An assassin's job wasn't just about avoiding guards and rivals. It was about navigating a world where even your so-called peers treated you as a ticking time bomb. And failure, when it happened, almost always meant death. If you somehow missed your target or botched your mission, there was no such thing as a quiet fallout. Targets would double their security, plaster your description everywhere, and turn the entire city against you. The hunters became the hunted, and there was no shortage of people willing to cash in on a bounty. Even your client, who had just lost their rival, might decide you weren't worth the risk anymore and send someone to tie up the unfortunate accident you'd become. Consider this. What does that do to a person, knowing that both success and failure lead to the same knife in the back? For most assassins, this wasn't a profession. It was a slow death sentence. Every move had to be calculated, every glance over the shoulder deliberate. And of course, it didn't mean they never made mistakes. Everyone does, eventually. But for assassins, mistakes weren't lessons. They were tombstones. Now, let's not pretend there was some way out of this. You couldn't just quit and retire. If you tried walking away, everyone who'd ever hired you would see you as a bigger liability than ever. They didn't trust you when you were working for them. So why would they trust you as a retired assassin living quietly in some remote village? The safest bet for them was to guarantee you'd never speak a word of everything you'd seen and done. And in this line of work, silence was best achieved with a blade, not a handshake. Trusting no one became the core philosophy for any assassin who managed to live more than a handful of years. But it wasn't just a defensive strategy, it was a lifestyle. It meant keeping people at arm's length, always suspecting ulterior motives, and second-guessing every offer of help. And even if that mistrust kept you alive, what kind of life was left to live? Human beings aren't meant to thrive in complete isolation, yet for an assassin, getting too close to anyone was its own form of professional suicide. In the end, loyalty wasn't just missing from the assassin's world, it was actively weaponized against them. The idea of trust became laughable, and betrayal wasn't the exception, it was the rule. If there was any solace in this brutal reality, it was that paranoia could keep you alive just a little longer. But at what cost? You could save yourself from the knife in the back, sure, but there was no protecting yourself from the crushing solitude that came with it. And speaking of solitude, there was one thing assassins valued above even the promise of silver or survival: silence. The quieter you stayed about your life and your work, the better chance you had of making it to the next morning. Because in a world without trust, even your voice could betray you. So how did they cope with that kind of isolation? Well, that's the next layer of this bleak story. Imagine a life where no one knows your name, not your real one anyway, and anyone who gets close enough to find it out becomes a risk. That's what being a medieval assassin meant. Permanent isolation. The shadows weren't just where you did your work, they were where you lived, day in and day out. And while the myths paint assassins as mysterious loners by choice, the truth is that their solitude wasn't some romantic quirk. It was survival. No allies, no confidants, no one to lean on. A life lived entirely in the dark. Here's the issue. When your job revolves around killing people for pay, nobody's lining up to be your friend, not even other criminals. While thieves and smugglers might have been willing to share a drink with each other around a fire, an assassin was untouchable, too dangerous, too unpredictable. Nobody wanted to accidentally end up on their bad side, or worse, be seen as an accomplice when an assassin's luck finally ran out. Knowing an assassin could bring the same kind of trouble as being one, so most people kept their distance. And honestly, the assassins preferred it that way. It's not like they could afford to trust anyone anyway. In their world, sharing even a piece of your real life, your background, your name, your face, was like handing someone a loaded crossbow pointed directly at your chest. Suppose you let someone in. What happens when they slip up? Maybe they don't mean to. Maybe it's an innocent comment to the wrong person. Suddenly, your carefully built cover is gone. Worse yet, someone might use what they know against you on purpose. Information about your past could make the perfect bargaining chip if someone needed to save themselves. Even an assassin had connections they needed to protect. A sister back in the village, a child no one knew about. And the minute your secret got out, those connections became leverage. To understand just how risky relationships were, consider romantic ones. You might think an assassin, being human after all, could find comfort in the company of a lover or partner. But in reality, long-term bonds like that were nearly impossible to maintain. Could you imagine sneaking away for secret meetings with someone who kept asking, "Where were you last week?" How do you explain disappearing for days at a time, or returning with bruises, blood, and muddy shoes? Keeping secrets from the entire world was hard enough, without adding the emotional strain of keeping them from the person you were supposed to trust most. And what if they accidentally let something slip? Pillow talk isn't exactly safe when your life depends on silence. There's an account that illustrates just how badly even a tiny misstep could go. Once, an assassin who had been operating under a false identity for years made the mistake of getting too close to someone in town, a young woman who worked for a merchant family. At first, he thought of her as a rare moment of warmth in his otherwise bleak life. But over time, his need to keep his secrets wore on the relationship. Stray comments about his past, his travels, his business trips started to add up for her. One day, he found out that she'd quietly mentioned her suspicions in passing. Harmless curiosity from her perspective, but devastating from his. By the following week, he was running for his life. Someone in the merchant family connected the dots and tipped off the local authorities. His face was plastered on notices, his name whispered in alleyways. The kindness he'd been so desperate for ended up costing him everything. But let's not pretend the blame lay entirely on outsiders. The kind of life assassins lived, the secrecy, the paranoia, fed back into itself endlessly. To protect yourself, you had to isolate yourself. And the more you isolated yourself, the less you felt like a person. Those heavy silences weighed on you after a while. No matter how strong-willed or ruthless you saw yourself, there's something about prolonged loneliness that chips away at anyone. Human beings crave connection, even the ones who claim they don't. But for a medieval assassin, connection was a dangerous craving, not a need that could be safely satisfied. If you couldn't turn to other people, how did you cope? It turns out, many assassins turned inward instead. Those who didn't completely lose their minds often became masters of disguise, pouring their energy into creating new versions of themselves. One day, you're a traveling merchant. The next, a beggar hoping for scraps. Constantly changing your identity might sound exciting, but in practice, it meant disappearing so thoroughly that even you started to forget who you once were. Real names, real memories, all of it sank under the weight of faked accents and false papers. Some assassins tried to find solace in routines. They sharpened their skills obsessively, practicing their craft not because they took pride in it, but because routine was one of the few things that kept reality feeling solid. A few even developed superstitions, little rituals they believed would keep bad luck at bay. Maybe they'd always carry a certain charm or avoid walking under trees on their way to a job. Were these rituals helpful? Probably not. But they gave the illusion of control in a life completely void of it. Mental health, as you can probably guess, wasn't a high priority back then. Depression, anxiety, and paranoia were considered either personal failings or divine punishments. For assassins, it was just part of the job. The worst part, they had no way to process what they experienced. No confidant to say, "This is eating me alive." The closest thing to therapy they got was maybe an empty bottle of stolen wine once the sun dipped below the horizon. But that was cold comfort after years of bearing every emotion under silence and suspicion. And society didn't help. Being feared wasn't the same as being respected. If someone even suspected you were an assassin, whether you were or weren't, you became an instant pariah. People wouldn't meet your eyes. Doors stayed shut when you passed through town. Even other criminals wanted nothing to do with you. Society treated assassins like they carried a disease, something to avoid touching, discussing, or even acknowledging. And yet, when powerful people needed someone dead, they always managed to look past their disgust long enough to slip an assassin the contract. The double standard wasn't lost on them. The isolation assassins endured wasn't necessarily limited to their work lives either. It followed them into every corner of their existence. They were perpetual outsiders. Picture moving from city to city, knowing you don't belong anywhere. Most people could at least fall back on some sense of home. A small village, a community where someone might remember their name. Assassins didn't get that. The few scraps of humanity they had left were buried under layers of deception and fear. They couldn't bond with anyone, not for long, at least. And even with isolation as their defense, as their invisible armor, it wasn't perfect. Stories floated around of assassins who let their guard slip. Maybe they thought they were safe, hidden away in some distant town, far from anyone who might know them. But safety was a myth in their line of work. It only took one whisper, one pair of eyes recognizing the wrong face, for everything to crumble. Anonymity wasn't just useful to assassins. It was their lifeline. Lose it, and you might as well be sharpening your own blade for someone else to use on you. Think for a moment about how much a life like this could weigh on someone's mind. The constant pressure, never being able to relax, to laugh without restraint, to say, "This is who I am," without consequence. Every moment of their lives became an act. Isolation became both their shield and their prison. Those words reflect the heart of what it meant to live on the margins, to be alone, not by choice, but by necessity. They were protected from enemies by the very fact that no one knew them. But in the process, they were robbed of the fundamental human connections that make life worth living in the first place. And yet, even all that isolation couldn't save them from failure. Because no matter how skilled you were, how many precautions you took, the possibility of slipping up was always there. One wrong move, and everything you'd done to stay hidden would unravel in an instant. Friends couldn't save you. Allies didn't exist. Isolation might have kept you alive a little longer, but it could never protect you from the consequences of your work. So what happened when failure caught up to them? That's where things took an even darker turn. Isolation helped them avoid a lot, but it could only carry them so far before reality came crashing down, and when it did, there was nowhere to hide. Failure wasn't just an inconvenience for a medieval assassin. It wasn't a chance to learn or bounce back. It was the end, usually violent, public, and merciless. The rules of the game were simple. Hit your target and disappear, or fail and face the consequences. And those consequences, they weren't just fatal. They were designed to turn your humiliation into entertainment for the crowd. Imagine this scenario. Your plan seems flawless. You've studied your target's routine, memorized the guard shifts, tucked your borrowed dagger carefully away. You slip into the shadows, your nerves coiled like the string of a drawn bow. But something goes wrong. A guard spots you, or maybe the target's friend, who was supposed to be out of town, decides to come home early. The moment your plans fall apart, the life you tried so hard to keep hidden unravels with it. Suddenly, you're no longer a nameless shadow. You're a fugitive, and the hunter has become the hunted. There were no quiet exits for assassins who failed. The moment you were exposed, your face ceased to be a mystery. Descriptions, however crude, began to circulate. A man with dark eyes, a woman with a limping step, a foreigner wearing patched boots. Tavern walls and market posts might display rough sketches or scrawled warnings. The authorities didn't always wait for accuracy. If their description was close enough, anyone unfortunate enough to match it was fair game. And then came the chase. Guards, bounty hunters, angry mobs. They all took up the banner of medieval justice, eager for your capture. But capture wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning of your suffering. Here's the thing about medieval punishments. They didn't just aim to punish the criminal. They aimed to terrify everyone watching. Executions weren't private, and they certainly weren't painless. When a failed assassin was caught, their death doubled as a cautionary tale. Ropes, fires, sharp tools, sometimes equipment like the rack or something charmingly nicknamed the bone cracker's delight came into play. Far from respectful killings, executions were drawn-out spectacles. After all, what better way to discourage others from following your lead than by setting an example as grim as possible? If you failed to take a life, the authorities would make a point of thoroughly taking yours. But it didn't stop there. Confessions, real or fabricated, became another source of entertainment. Captured assassins would be tortured until they confessed to everything from poisoning the local duke to hexing the baker's dog. It didn't matter if these accusations made sense either. The goal wasn't truth, but theatrics. If someone could be painted as a bigger threat, perhaps tied to a larger conspiracy, the public felt justified in their outrage. By the end, the assassin wasn't just an individual anymore. They became the embodiment of fear, and that fear was used to tighten control over anyone daring to step too far out of line. There's a known story, whether exaggerated or true, of one assassin who attempted to poison a feuding noble. To put it generously, their plan lacked precision. The poison never made it past the cautious kitchen staff, but the blame never stopped at them either. Once discovered, the assassin didn't get a quick death. Instead, they got a public interrogation, carried out one broken finger at a time, until they confessed to crimes that may or may not have ever happened. By the time their execution came, their name was meant to be remembered only as a warning. Someone whose attempts to disrupt the natural order earned them nothing but a slow, agonizing descent into infamy. And perhaps the most tragic part isn't even the assassin's suffering, but the collateral damage failure caused. For many assassins, anonymity was their most valuable currency. It kept them safe. It kept their families safe. But once a name or face was exposed, everyone even remotely connected to them was in danger. The authorities weren't interested in nuance. If they couldn't catch the assassin or simply wanted to make an example out of the situation, they'd round up anyone who might have helped them. A sister with no idea what her brother did when he disappeared for weeks. A tavern owner who rented out a room without asking too many questions. Suddenly, they were all suspects, facing fines, imprisonment, or sometimes worse. Even if the assassin's family remained untouched by legal punishment, the social consequences could be ruinous. A family name could be dragged through the mud, whispered about in every market stall and church pew. Could you imagine being the child of someone tried and executed for murder? Every glance from a neighbor, every muttered word behind your back would remind you of your parents' failure. And if you think that's bad, picture being the person who unwittingly sold supplies to an assassin, a piece of rope, a bit of poison. Suddenly, you're not just a merchant. You're a collaborator, fined or shunned just for doing your job. Fear of exposure didn't stop at your name being spoken aloud. It extended to the tools of art and rumor. Crude sketches and fragmented descriptions existed largely for practical reasons, to help identify suspects. But they had another terrifying effect. They turned people into walking targets. If someone looked even vaguely like the sketch tacked to a public notice board, they could face suspicion, or worse. For all the effort assassins poured into remaining invisible, One slip could turn them into folklore, a figure people whispered about long after their death, each retelling adding more blood to the story than the last. So how did they avoid this fate? Paranoia, for starters. Assassins became masters of erasing their presence, moving from town to town, shedding identities, and picking up new ones like stray clothing left behind in an abandoned stable. They made gathering information about them as difficult as possible. No permanent addresses, no lingering too long with familiar faces, no patterns that could be tracked. Many made a point of leaving behind no physical evidence, no letters, no keepsakes, no ties to their name or past. Being untraceable wasn't just a tactic, it was their existence. But even if an assassin made every precaution, failure could still catch up to them. Because at the end of the day, the odds weren't ever really in their favor. The sheer complexity of their work, combined with the primitive tools and chaotic environments of the time, meant things could spiral out of control no matter how careful they were. And if failure ever did come knocking, they knew there was no one to help them. No guild to vouch for them. No secret network to smuggle them out. No influential ally to plead their case. The safety nets we take for granted today didn't exist in their world. For an assassin, success wasn't about glory. They weren't in it for fame or honor or even lasting power. Success was survival. Barely making it to the next job, the next city, the next shred of anonymity. It was gritting your teeth through close calls and thinking, at least I'm still breathing. But even that came at a cost. Every success stacked up the odds that your luck was about to run out. Failure wasn't a matter of if, but when. And let's be clear, when failure came, it didn't care how many kills you'd carried out before, or how meticulous you'd been up until now. It only took one slip, one guard patrolling in a place they weren't supposed to be, one poison that didn't work quickly enough, one person who recognized you from somewhere you didn't even remember. The life of a medieval assassin was balanced on the edge of a knife, and failure was the push that sent everything crashing down. So what about the rare moments when they beat the odds, when they hit their target, disappeared without a trace, and lived to see another day? You might think those moments offered some kind of satisfaction, but even success came with a shadow trailing close behind, a reminder that survival didn't mean safety. It only meant that the nightmare was changing shape into something even harder to predict. Because once you've survived failure, you still have to survive what comes next. And for an assassin in the Middle Ages, surviving didn't just mean dodging swords or outrunning betrayal. It meant facing things far worse than anything they experienced on the job. Congratulations, you've just assassinated your target. The blade found its mark, your escape route worked, and now you're free. Of course not. Killing the person was the simple part. The real nightmare is what happens after. You can't stand over the scene and admire your handiwork, and you definitely can't hang around waiting for your paycheck. The second they hit the ground, your life becomes a race against the clock, and the people hunting for you are already moving. It starts with the city locking down. Before dawn breaks, every gate slams shut, guards flood the streets, and checkpoints appear at every exit. That's assuming the target was important enough to cause panic. But even if they weren't, word spreads quickly, far too quickly. Alerts go up, descriptions start circulating, crudely written, hastily drawn, but still dangerous. With every passing hour, more people know about an armed figure last seen heading toward the docks or slipping into the woods. The whole city becomes one giant trap. Staying put is asking to die. Running requires a plan you've hopefully spent weeks or months preparing. Escape isn't some frantic last-minute scramble. Not if you want to pull it off. Assassins spend as much time planning how to get out as they do plotting the kill itself. Where's the closest safe house? Which alleyways can you vanish into without being seen? How do you blend into a crowd if the city suddenly overflows with people eager to find you? If guards stop you, can you fake a limp and pass as a poor beggar? Or do you have another disguise stashed somewhere? A merchant's apron, a traveling monk's robes that lets you slip past unnoticed? Even your innocent face might be part of the plan. A moment's hesitation at a checkpoint can get you killed. Confidence isn't just helpful, it's survival. But let's say you make it out. You've crossed the river or darted through the woods, and the shouts of guards have faded behind you. You're not home free yet, far from it. The name of the assassin might still be unknown to the public, but the goal of every noble, soldier, or hunter out there is the same. Find you. You can't rest, and you certainly can't head back to wherever you came from. Even if the city is behind you, there are still eyes watching the roads, ports, inns, and markets. It's not enough to run. You have to erase yourself completely. Life after a successful assassination is all about reinvention. You can't stay the person you are, and you can't let yourself fall into any pattern that ties you to your past. You've got to craft a new identity. Start over in a town where no one knows you. One option? Find the farthest corner of some muddy village. Limp into town with a story of being a wounded ex-soldier, and hope no one looks closely enough to see the blood still drying on your boots. Another option? Pose as a seller of herbs. Someone too dull to appear dangerous. Almost anything can work, as long as you don't stand out. The trick is knowing that even this new role, this new life is temporary. You're always waiting for the day when someone connects the dots and it all falls apart again. It might sound exhausting. That's because it is. But this endless cycle, kill, escape, start over, was the reality for most assassins who knew how to survive. Even if you made it out alive, you carried the constant weight of what or who might be waiting just over the horizon. And don't expect any help from the person who hired you either. If you think your client is sitting in a luxurious chamber, counting out silver to reward your hard work, think again. They've probably already disappeared. Here's the situation. The same skills that make you good at the job, stealth, adaptability, lethal precision, also make you a liability. You know too much about your client's secrets and their willingness to commit murder to solve their problems. The moment you fulfilled your end of the deal, they start wondering how long before you're their next problem. It's often safer for them to cut you loose. Or worse, send someone after you to keep you permanently quiet. Clients in the medieval world weren't known for their loyalty. In fact, some disappeared completely, leaving you unpaid and unprotected. One assassin reportedly carried out the perfect kill, only to find their promised payment was nowhere to be found. The client, perhaps sensing the loose end they had created, had vanished without a trace, leaving the assassin stranded. With no money, no allies, and no guarantee of safety, there wasn't much they could do. Hunting the client down to demand payment wasn't exactly an option. It just meant more exposure. For assassins, betrayal wasn't a question of if, it was a certainty. Every deal came with the understanding that whoever handed you the job might also be lining up the next person to kill you. Even without betrayal from a client, success carried its own punishments. The blood you spilled had consequences. People out there wanted you dead for what you did, and you could never be sure when those consequences might catch up to you. Getting away today didn't guarantee safety tomorrow. It wasn't just the guards or the victim's family you had to worry about. Sometimes the greatest threat came from others in the same line of work. Assassins weren't necessarily a tight-knit group. If anything, they saw each other as competition. But that didn't stop clients from hiring one assassin to clean up after another. The idea of a younger, hungrier killer pursuing you, maybe someone faster or just luckier, wasn't some distant horror story. It was a very real possibility. Skilled or not, every assassin eventually became an older, slower version of the same person they used to be. And those younger assassins wanted what you had, or to erase your mark so they could step into it. There was no room for solidarity in this world. So what's left? You've succeeded, escaped, and started over. But what kind of life can you build on those ashes? The answer, for most, was no life at all. Retirement wasn't an option. There were no quiet ends to an assassin's career because nobody wanted you to stop working. They wanted you to vanish. And in this line of work, vanishing often meant death. Even for those who managed to avoid direct threats, the isolation was a weight no one could escape. Imagine living in a state of constant vigilance. Every knock at the door is a potential threat. Every market stall might hold someone who recognizes you. Every town you enter could be the one where your luck finally runs out. You don't live, you exist, moving from place to place, face to face, always wondering when the end will come. Some try to fake simpler lives, blending in by taking up benign trades like farmer, healer, or wandering peddler. They might even feign illnesses, hobble around on crutches, or wear masks to keep people from looking too closely. But no matter how convincing the disguise, the fear lingered. Because an assassin knows their worst enemy isn't just the people searching for revenge or silver. It's their own shadow, their own past. You can change your appearance and your name, but you can't change the blood you've spilled, and that blood follows you everywhere. And yet, despite the paranoia and the constant running, some assassins held onto a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could escape the cycle. If they ran far enough, hit smart enough, or killed the right person to close the chapter, perhaps they could find peace. But peace was a fantasy. Even if the rest of the world forgot what you did, you'd never forget. You'd never stop looking over your shoulder. Success wasn't rewarded. It wasn't freedom or a fresh start. It was the beginning of a new kind of nightmare. One where you carried the weight of what you'd done, and the knowledge that doing it again might be the only way to survive. But as if that wasn't bad enough, the superstitions of the time made everything worse. Because success alone didn't just make you a target, it turned you into something more, something feared, hated, and cursed by the world around you. And that fear, in its own way, shaped the shadowy lives of assassins as much as any blade or betrayal. What if, the moment you set foot in a town, people started whispering that you were cursed? Not because they knew who you were or what you'd done, but because there was something just off about you. Maybe it was the way you avoided eye contact or how you always seemed to emerge from the shadows at just the wrong time. Whatever it was, in the medieval world, it didn't take much for suspicion to snowball into accusations, and for those accusations to turn deadly. For most people back then, the line between what was natural and what was supernatural was razor thin, and if you happened to cross it, even unintentionally, you were in trouble. Assassins, with their secretive lives, strange tools, and willingness to kill without hesitation, fit neatly into the category of things people didn't understand, or more importantly, things they feared. The church preached that murder was a sin, so anyone who made a career of it couldn't just be immoral. They had to be something worse. If an assassin wasn't in league with the devil, they were at least flirting with the idea, or so the stories went. In a world fueled by superstition, it wasn't enough for an assassin to avoid the guards or an angry client. They also had to dodge accusations of witchcraft or demonic influence. The second someone important dropped dead, whether it was from poison, a knife to the ribs, or a mysterious fall, it didn't take long for people to start filling in the blanks with whatever explanation scared them most. More often than not, it was easier to blame some dark magic than face the fact that a skilled and desperate person had outsmarted everyone. And just like that, assassins weren't just human threats. They became the stuff of nighttime prayers and cautionary tales. This fear wasn't purely abstract either. It often translated into direct physical danger. People didn't need proof to act on their suspicions. All it took was one bad harvest, one plague outbreak, or one unexplained death, and suddenly, the mob had its excuse. The idea that assassins whispered to demons mixed poisons under moonlight, or carried daggers cursed by dark forces, wasn't just folklore, it was ammunition. If you were unlucky enough to have the blame land on you, your best case scenario was getting chased out of town. Worst case, try stones, torches, or a pyre. Even their tools, crude and basic as they often were, added to the fear. A dagger wasn't just a dagger. A blade coated in poison wasn't just practical, it was unnatural. Rumors spread that these weapons were forged in a cursed forge, or that the poisons they used weren't chemistry at all, but witchcraft. It probably didn't help that medieval poisons were as unpredictable as they were deadly. If one victim died instantly and the next lingered for hours, people naturally assumed the poisoner had some supernatural ability to control the outcome. The real kicker: you didn't even have to be an actual assassin to suffer the consequences of these rumors. Suspicion alone was enough for mobs to act. Picture a healer, maybe someone who worked with herbs and tinctures, arriving in a village not long after some mysterious death. Someone notices the small knife on their belt or the strange bottles in their bag, and suddenly whispers turn into accusations. Poisoner, someone says, maybe even a devil's servant. No proof, no trial, just fear. The accusations snowball until the mob is screaming to burn him before he calls lightning. And no matter how innocent you were, there wasn't much you could say to convince people otherwise. There's one grim example of how these superstitions could spiral out of control. A high-profile noble's death sent shockwaves through a major city, particularly because it came so suddenly. The man had been alive and well at supper, but hours later he was found dead in his chambers. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just an eerie, lifeless body left behind. Whispers began almost immediately. It had to be poison. The rumors quickly stretched further. Whoever had killed him must have been in league with something unholy. It didn't take long before suspicion latched onto a servant who worked nearby. Someone known for being strange, though no one could define why. Was he actually the assassin? Probably not. But by then it didn't matter. He was dragged into the street, accused not only of killing the noble, but of using black magic to do it. The mob's justice ensured he didn't live to tell his side of the story. This paranoia didn't just make life more dangerous for assassins, it made it harder to hide. Every crowd carried an undercurrent of unease. Maybe someone saw your blade. Maybe someone noticed the bruise along your hand and thought it looked like the mark of the devil's pact. Superstition added another layer of paranoia to lives that were already drowning in it. It's bad enough to have guards chasing you for money. It's worse when a mob armed with pitchforks and half-truths wants to see you burn. Even something like being too skilled or too lucky could work against you. Let's say you successfully assassinate a target, slipping in and out without even waking the guards, leaving no clear trace of how it was done. Success didn't bring respect. It brought fear. People wondered how it was possible for anyone, just a regular human being, to vanish so completely or kill so quietly. It didn't take much for that fear to turn into accusations that you weren't a regular human at all, that you were something darker. It's hard to imagine what this constant suspicion would do to your frame of mind. You might leave a contract thinking you'd covered all your tracks, but you'd never really feel safe. What if someone saw something out of the corner of their eye? What if a neighbor connected to incidents that were entirely innocent, but sounded damning when whispered over ale? It wasn't enough to escape physically. You were always fighting to escape the stories people spun around you. So how did assassins try to avoid detection in such a superstitious world? The same way they avoided everything else, keeping their heads down. They relied on cover stories, disguises, and above all, silence. The less anyone knew about you, the less they could use against you. Whether it was the law, a vengeful client, or a mob convinced you'd struck a deal with the devil himself. Many assassins carefully chose their tools and methods to avoid the appearance of anything unnatural. Poisoning a target's food might be effective, but stabbing them outright left less room for wild rumors to take hold. A death that looked mundane, ordinary violence, nothing unusual, was safer. But no strategy was perfect. The mere idea of assassins as cursed or fearsome figures didn't just hurt them individually. It shaped how society treated them as a group. For the people, assassins weren't just criminals. They were monsters, living proof that there was something wrong with the world. They weren't owed mercy, understanding, or even respect, regardless of what drove them to the blade in the first place. Whether guilty or innocent, they became easy scapegoats for everything wrong in a time of chaos and uncertainty. Superstition turned assassins into convenient villains, haunting figures that villagers could point to when life got hard. Disease outbreak, an assassin poisoned the well. A local lord mysteriously disappears. An assassin did it, probably using a frog gut potion during the full moon. Fear of them became a kind of shorthand for explaining life's tragedies. They were both the embodiment of human greed and something far darker, shadowy, cursed figures who could never be part of normal society. And yet, for all the terror they inspired, their lives remained impossibly precarious. You could fear an assassin, hate them, even invent stories about them, but you could never really remember them. That's the irony, isn't it? The same superstition that made them seem larger than life also erased their real stories. History turned them into rumors, myths, and cautionary tales. The actual people behind the shadows became ghosts. Their names, their lives, their struggles, all of it blurred into a collective fear of something that might have never even existed as people imagined. But of course, people didn't stop to mourn or question their own fear. They sent assassins to the gallows, the pyres, or into hiding, and then carried on, repeating the same patterns whenever the next mysterious death came along. That's the cruelest twist in their tale. They lived in a world where their every action, real or imagined, made them into monsters. And when their luck finally ran out, they disappeared into the fog of history without leaving a trace. But if there's one thing history does remember, it's the price of being forgotten. Because for assassins, that erasure wasn't just the end. It was the final proof that their lives were never, at any point, their own. And yet their vanishing act leaves us with one more question. Why, after all this fear, has time chosen to leave them in the shadows? So, who were these medieval assassins really? And why, despite their brutal and fascinating lives, do their names feel like they've been pulled straight from the void? The truth is, we don't remember them, and that's no accident. Their anonymity was both their shield and their prison, and history eagerly erased whatever scraps of their stories might have remained. The thing about being an assassin is that anonymity wasn't just a perk, it was mandatory. Every job they took required them to vanish the moment it was done. No boasting, no trail of evidence, no lingering to collect applause. An assassin couldn't go around bragging about their latest work in the local tavern. Keeping their identity hidden wasn't just about self-preservation. It was also enforced by the people who hired them. Clients wanted a one-time service, not a relationship. The idea was simple. The fewer people who knew what happened, the less likely it would come back to haunt them. If you got rid of someone who knew too much, why wouldn't you do the same to the person who did the dirty work for you? The reality of why we don't know their names is painfully practical. Assassins couldn't leave behind any evidence of what they did. Not tools, not letters, not even rumors. Anything tying them to a crime decreased their odds of survival. They weren't exactly strolling around medieval towns, commissioning portraits, or having their deeds carved onto statues. There are no ballads celebrating their exploits, no dusty accounts penned by scribes that tell you where they lived or how they spent their days. Their successes, the few they managed, weren't events you could record with pride. And if anyone thought of writing those stories down, you can bet someone else worked just as hard to make sure those records disappeared. Even if an assassin's name survived for a time, clients had every reason to erase it. Let's say a powerful noble hired someone to take out their rival. The kill succeeds, the rival is eliminated, and that noble isn't about to let their involvement leak out. One way to keep the whole thing quiet? Silence the assassin entirely. The client disappears, forgets to pay, or sends another killer after the first. It's not like the assassin can just show up in court, demanding fair payment for murdering Lord So-and-so. Even if they managed to walk away with their life, the last thing their employer wanted was their name floating around as a loose thread. Here's an example to consider. There's historical speculation that a famous noble, perhaps a king or a high-ranking lord, employed assassins to remove political threats. The hired killers got the job done, efficient, lethal, and quiet. But when the dust settled, their identities vanished completely. All we're left with are the names of those who commissioned the work. No one recorded the assassin's face, and no one wondered about their story. The client erased their tracks, either through dismissal, betrayal, or worse. And since history is usually written by those with power, the story conveniently focused on the noble who benefited from the killing, rather than the person who carried it out. This brings us to the heart of the problem, the power imbalance. Assassins didn't have social standing, and that made them invisible in the long run. Most came from the very bottom of society. Starving peasants with nothing to lose, disgraced soldiers too broken to return to the battlefield, or outcasts who'd already been forgotten by the world. These weren't people with connections, wealth, or influence. They weren't the ones commissioning stained glass windows or donating to monasteries to immortalize their legacies. When they disappeared, the world barely noticed. Their erasure wasn't a deliberate punishment. It was just another symptom of being expendable. Think about it. Medieval history is deeply biased. What we know about the period often comes from the records of kings, nobles, and clergy, the people with money, authority, and access to scribes who could write things down. These records prioritize the lives of the powerful and the events deemed important to them. The story of a poor assassin, even one with remarkable skill, had no place in these annals. Documents about noble feasts, alliances, and weddings took precedence over the details of some forgotten knife for hire. Even the way assassins were killed turned them into footnotes. If they got caught, their fates weren't kind. Some were unceremoniously dumped into unmarked graves, while others were turned into public warnings, their hanging bodies left to rot in the village square. These were spectacles meant to erase individuality. A head on a spike isn't about the person who once bore it. It's a symbol of failure and fear. When survival depends on staying hidden and erasure follows failure, you can see why remembering assassins as individuals feels impossible. Focusing on their lack of status also explains why their absence from history feels so complete. Assassins weren't mourned. They weren't celebrated. They lived apart from society, taking what work they could to survive while knowing full well that no one would come to their defense if things went wrong. Everything that made them good at their job also made it easy for history to forget them. Who was going to write stories about someone no one wanted to admit they'd hired? Who was going to preserve the life of someone society considered a curse when they were alive? Even on the rare occasion an assassin brushed against fame, their anonymity still worked against them. Take the legends of high-profile targets. Kings or generals cut down in ambition or betrayed by someone close to them. These stories often leave a blank space where the assassin's name should be, replacing their contribution with hazy details or the implication of some larger conspiracy. Maybe tales spread of a shadowy figure from the east, or a ghost-like killer unknown to all. Fiction filled in the gaps left by silence. And once rumors replaced facts, what little truth remained about the assassin's life was gone for good. But what does this tell us about how history remembers people? It tells us that historical records favor the winners, the powerful, and the people who had a hand in shaping the narrative. It shows us that the stories of those on the margins, those who served, suffered, or survived, were rarely seen as worth preserving. The more disposable someone seemed in life, the more likely they were to be forgotten in death. And assassins, by design, were among the most disposable people of all. The sad irony is that an assassin's entire profession revolved around erasure. Their job, to erase lives. Their goal, to walk away without being traced. Their survival depended on secrecy. Even when they succeeded, their victories were immediate and fleeting, not something to be etched into stone. The result of all this secrecy wasn't just that assassins faded from public memory. They were actively pushed into it, one forgotten figure at a time. The price of their work, their success, and their survival was being erased from the story altogether. The ultimate cost of being a medieval assassin wasn't just the physical toll, the endless paranoia, or the likelihood of betrayal. It was being erased from time itself. Their lives, their faces, their names were swallowed by history, leaving behind almost nothing but whispers. That disappearance wasn't accidental. Their erasure was deliberate, necessary, and inevitable. And yet, despite their invisibility, there's something haunting about their stories. They remind us that history isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's a story shaped by who gets remembered and who doesn't. The assassins who lived and died in the shadows never had the chance to control the narrative, but their existence, faint as it feels, offers a perspective we rarely think about. What was it like to live a life so hidden that even history forgot you existed? And what does that say about our need to tell stories only about those at the top, while the people who lived in the margins are left in obscurity? For medieval assassins, their reality was bleak, bloody, and unforgiving. But their absence in the records isn't just a story of invisibility. It's a powerful reminder of how easily the world forgets those who lived their lives in silence. And that might be why their legacy, even if lost, still lingers in the shadows they left behind. Being a medieval assassin wasn't a life. It was a slow, lonely death sentence. No glory, no comrades, no legacy. Just an endless fight to survive a world waiting to forget you. Their stories remind us what happens when survival comes at the cost of everything else. A life carefully erased to protect the powerful and convenient. So next time life feels overwhelming, maybe pause to appreciate the choices and stability we often take for granted. If this glimpse into the shadows intrigued you, stick around for more stories of history's forgotten lives. There's always more lurking in the past, waiting to be uncovered.